Jericho, you have a very distinctive reading style. I was wondering if that was influenced by anything, or if that just...
Stole my question.
Aretha Franklin.
You're in the next edition of the book.
No, I think that I think it's 33% nervousness that I get really nervous, so I try to slow down and try to really experience every word, and then it's 33% trying to put myself. I find that I can be less nervous if I put myself in the same position that I was in when I was writing a poem. You know, back when I was like this guy walking around in his underwear at 3 a.m. chanting to myself. Do you know what I mean? Like if I could sort of act like people aren't looking at me, but I'm sort of drunk on syntax and having a good time because I have lines and I'm working with them, and thank God, you know what I mean? Like I'm just glad I'm writing a poem, you know what I mean? Like I try to do that. And then I think the last third is, like I said, I was raised in the church, and one of my, well, you know, one of my idols was our pastor. When we were growing up, his name was Harry Blake. And I mean, it was just really exciting to see him do everything that he would do on a Sunday morning. He would do a lot. And so the entire time I was growing up, because we were really active in church, I was growing up with other kids who had a practice of, as part of our good time in being in church, you know, imitating our pastor. And I think, you know, like we would go from Sunday school and we'd be like, and now it's time for, you know, and then we would all, like, it would like be competitions on who could do the best Harry Blake, you know? And I think a lot of that, when I started reading in front of people, for whatever reason, what I think of as playfulness, but might not come across as playfulness when I'm up here. But when I was a kid, I was just playing when I would do it, right? I think of that as playfulness when I was doing it. I think that's part of what begins to come out, so.
There's questions.
I have a question for all three of you. As storytellers, what's most important to you as you're trying to tell your story? Is there a common theme or a technique or an intent, or what's most important to you?
Boom! You guys can feel it past the microphone.
I have an answer, so I'll just go ahead.
go ahead.
Okay, so I think the thing that's important to me is that what's most important to me is that I assume the story is there and that I pay it absolutely no attention. That I think of it as something that will emerge as opposed to something that I can make happen. I mean, the most important thing to me when I'm writing a poem is the music of the poem. I mean, as a matter of fact, my first draft of a poem never makes any sense. And if it does, then I'm sort of skeptical of it, right? My first draft of a poem is always write a line. I mean, the way I write a poem is like that line, then I write another line that riffs off of the sound of that line, then I write another line that riffs off the sound of that line. And it's like me trying to like make a series of sounds that sound good to me. And sometimes they don't make any sense. You know, when I first wrote, I mean, I know this for a fact, that when I wrote I'm Such an Ugly Girl, I'm Such an Ugly Girl, I had no idea that the poem was going to be Janis Joplin. And I know I'm not a girl, so, you know what I mean? Like, it was just something that came out and I wrote it down to get to the next line, you know, and I move on to the next thing, not really thinking about story or narrative or even the contiguous nature that we might think literature has. And I think what helps me is that from that point of having that set of lines, I then push toward, rather than pushing toward narrative, I start thinking much more about who's speaking or what is the personality of these lines or what is the voice of these lines. But I don't think in terms of story. Does that make sense to you, what I'm saying? So I think like, whereas I mean for me, when I started writing, I noticed that I had all these things to say and all these stories to tell, right? And then I would end up writing a bunch of bad poems because I'd be wanting to talk about the time that this thing happened, you know? Whereas the time, if you're a poet, I think, the time that this thing happened can't help but emerge because that's all you have. You know, it's all of your experiences and all of your imagination and all of your intellect will come out in the poem, is what I think. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I kind of want to add to that. I definitely don't encounter like a particular narrative when I begin. And in fact, in the first generation of a work, I deliberately make sure that I'm not harboring any particular ethical or moral perspectives on what I should be generating. And so in the first, I truly mean this, like in the sense of a radical...
We were conversations about that yesterday, so it gave me that.
Oh, absolutely. I think there's a deliberate sacrifice of self to the language and to the music, which requires a kind of radical openness to laws and customs beyond understood moralities. And so it is, for me, definitely like the musicality of language, which ends up generating, after months, if not years of editing, a certain type of narrative, if one could call it that, whether it's either a musical narrative or a particular linear kind of storytelling. And for me, that's like, I love writing and generating, and that's very different for me than publishing. And so like, I literally do have like 1,000 poems that I'll never show to the world. However, when I construct a book as a cultural item, I deliberately know that it's going to go out there and influence the public, and also generate a public. And with that in mind, like the forming of a book is very much a political act for me. And so each of these books are with that consciousness. However, the actual poem that I make as an artist, independent of a cultural producer that's generating something for the public, is two different modes that I'm very conscious of. If that makes any sense.
So one way that I would answer that question is to invoke James Baldwin, who's one of the writers that I think about a lot. And in the story Sonny's Blues that I mentioned, he has this moment of listening to a musical performance and trying to kind of translate it. There's no words, it's just instrumental, it's like a jam session, a number of artists. And he says, that it seems like they're sort of telling the same story that we're always telling. So the tale of how we suffer and how we fall in love is never new, but it must continuously be told. There's no other story we really have to tell, and it's the only light we have in all this darkness. And that's a paraphrase, but it's a pretty, you get the idea. And so I feel that first, as a scholar in the field of African American studies, we're kind of always telling the same story, which is the way that people have made a way out of no way, right? Whether writers or artists or different kinds of culture workers. And yet for me it's important too to listen, and to listen very carefully to both what the writers are doing, and to what the musicians are doing, to kind of listen in detail. And because the story only gets more interesting and more sort of rich and complicated or complex the closer that you listen. And so that's sort of what I'm trying to do in all of my work, whoever I'm writing about.
Other questions? Son?
Yeah, I'd like to ask you guys, you're all from different parts of the country. What's your impression of Wisconsin?
I like the cheese curds.
I just said that.
I was thinking like from a writer's perspective.
I like the cheese curds.
Cheese curds are kind of interesting.
Well, I was told to try the cheese curds.
We went to that bookstore that you should tell.
Oh my God! You have like the most amazing like poetry bookstore in the country.
Preach.
Yeah. So it was, to me, like it was walking into a toy store. And I think oftentimes in poetry and in theory, playfulness is such a huge part. And for me, walking into a huge poetry bookstore was like, oh my God! Fangirl!
What's it called?
What's the name of the bookstore? What was the name of the bookstore we went to?
Wood pattern.
Woodland Pattern Bookstore in Milwaukee on Locust Street. They've been for over 30 years having an annual poetry marathon, and that'll be coming up the last Saturday in January. And they have people reading poetry. They have someone reading poetry for 5 minutes from 10 a.m. until 1 a.m. the next day. So if you're interested in seeing a real piece of Wisconsin culture that is incredibly valuable, look that up. I'm glad you guys visited. Thank you to Rachel for taking it. Other reflections on Wisconsin? For Tom?
I mean, I guess
For me, this is like my second day here ever, so.
Say something smart.
Yeah, so obviously I'm an expert and I have a lot of good things to say. No, but I think as often happens, I know a place through the people and through the moments that you have with people and the relationships that you have. So for me, you know, it's my cousin Lindsay and Brian and it's Nick and it's my new friends, amazing poets. The fact that they check my book out of the library is a great thing about Wisconsin, and that you all were here. So yeah, that's what it is for me. Thank you.
Any other questions?
You talked, Michael, you talked about your grandmother being in hospice, and you said something about sentimental or something?
Santitos. Yeah, I guess I would translate it as spirits, little saints. Curandero is like a medicine worker. It depends, there's varieties of curanderos, curanderas, but typically someone who, like a patera is like someone who helps with birthing, but always in connection with the world of spirit. And that's, my grandmother is a curandera, and so going, like my earliest memory as a child was going to a seance and going to curanderas, and so that worldview is always present to some degree in my language, which is why poetry is, its etherealness and its ability to transcend even itself, as language is always doing, even in the act of metaphor and trying to mean, alludes to so much more. And so, I don't know if that responds to your comment.
So is that a Native American thing?
Well, it's definitely like a Mexican American hybrid of Catholicism and indigenous faith beliefs. So.
There's a question in the back.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jericho, I was wondering, you mentioned when you were setting up your books that you talked about how this cover was important to you, and I was staring at it and I would read it. And I was wondering if you could talk more about the cover of your new book.
Yeah, the cover, it's a 19th century French painting by Leon Bonnat, who never painted black people, but suddenly did this one time. I mean, as far as I could tell, never. I mean, you know, I'm not an art history scholar or anything, but I've looked at a few of his images over the years, and somebody sent it to me, and I didn't know it was Bonnat, but I just really fell in love with it. Something about my book that I didn't mention, and I don't think I read any of the poems that deal with this, but there's a one of the thematic lines going through the book is that there's this sort of sibling rivalry between these two brothers, and so part of the reason why the book is called the New Testament is that it evokes these sort of family relationships that are present in the Bible, where people have, you know, Leah and Rachel didn't really get along, and Cain and Abel certainly did not, and do you know what I mean? But then, you know, there are other relationships that are sort of really interesting when you think about the fact that Jesus was baptized by his first cousin, sort of really, you know, and his first cousin like sees Jesus like he's never seen him before. He's like, what are you doing here? You know, it's like, it's just really, so I'm just sort of fascinated by those relationships, but more than that, obviously, I'm really interested in trying to see if those relationships could say something about citizenship in this world and in this country in particular. And so, if y'all haven't seen the book, I'm talking about everything except the cover, right? If you haven't seen the book, the cover is of, it's called The Barber of Suez, and it's of a man giving a shave with a straight razor to another man. But in that moment of sort of the image, it's either that somebody's going to get taken care of, or they're going to get groomed, or they're going to get murdered, right? And so I was sort of interested in the vulnerability of that moment and how it sort of is this intersection between love and violence, which I'm always sort of fascinated by. So that's how somebody sent it to me, and I was like, and they just sent it to me because they thought I would like it, and I was like, oh my God, this is what I've been writing about for 6 years. And I was so glad it was old, because that meant it was like I didn't have to pay for it. So, y'all know when stuff is old, it's public domain. I didn't know this. I was all like, oh my God, Copper Cane is going to be like, we can't afford it. And I'm going to have to find $600,000. But I didn't have to do that, because it was so old that it was free. And it made me very happy. So that's the story.
Last question going once, going twice. All right, last question, up in the front.
Is it Emily?
Yeah.
So a lot of the musicians that you talk about, or at least you talk about, are like gone.
Real loud.
Oh, so a lot of the musicians she was talking about are gone. Like, I'm just wondering, like, because you delve so deeply into like their lines and their lyrics and their feelings and instrumentation, like current day musicians that might invoke the same enthusiasm.
Good question.
Okay.
It's like that. Okay, all right.
Yeah, I had a question about that too, because I wonder if you think that's purposeful.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
If it's purposeful that writers are mainly writing about people who are no longer, or
like his question is the question, right? Like current day musicians who evoke the same kind of enthusiasm.
Right.
Like, can you write about Janelle Monáe doing something similar to that? Do you understand what I mean? But then the next question that I would have then is like, you know, obviously Janelle Monáe or India Arie don't have the same kind of platform that people like the Supremes or that Aretha Franklin or that Sam Cooke had. They don't have the same kind of influence on black people or people at all, period, that those people had at that time.
Yeah.
And so like, you know, because I'm a conspiracy theorist, I sometimes wonder if that's like part of the game. Do you understand what I mean? Because it's almost like, you know, like Aretha Franklin was doing stuff like Ready to Post Bail for Angela Davis. You know what I mean? But like, you wouldn't find an artist who's like got a #1 hit trying to post bail for nobody. You know what I'm saying? So like, but answer his question, but then like answer mine as well.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, Janelle Monáe would be a good example. She's an artist who I love, and one thing that's so interesting about her is just how sort of deeply citational her work is. So she's thinking very historically. You know, she's very consciously referencing, you know, everybody from, I would say, you know, Bessie Smith to a kind of Grace Jones to Jimi Hendrix to Prince, definitely Stevie Wonder everywhere, James Brown, yeah, for sure, and it's on like Tightrope, Funkadelic, and you know, George Clinton in his, you know, just like incredible like circus of people in her stage shows, and so, you know, very consciously putting herself into this incredible musical tradition and saying, you know, understand me as an inheritor, but also somebody who is deeply indebted to this amazing kind of history, right? In terms of kind of what happened since, I guess what Nelson George would call the kind of death of rhythm and blues, right? And the sort of, I mean, part of it is the consolidation and the corporatization of American popular music, right? And just that there's so many fewer kind of voices that are able to be heard, that at least, you know, I mean, you have like Atlantic Records, and Aretha is this superstar of Atlantic Records for a while, but there are many other people recording, you know, at that time. So we get people like Donny Hathaway, you know, Roberta Flack, and but there are several other like stars who could be on a particular label. And not only do you have Atlantic, but you have Stax, right? In Memphis, you have High Records, people like Al Green are recording, Isaac Hayes, you know, at Stax, and then just, you know, all over the country there are people whose voices are actually being heard, you know, are being distributed, you know, nationally and internationally. And it's just, there just aren't as many labels, there aren't as many people who get into that spotlight now and have that kind of impact. And the people who do, many people argue, have to be on one very particular kind of message. Yeah, so you can't go too far, you know, out of the bounds, or else, you know, you're kind of shut down. And we see that aspiring rappers a lot of times who feel like they have to be one particular way in order to get a contract in the first place. And so, I mean, I'm not totally down on the music industry. I think that there are a lot of great things happening, but you have to really be committed to finding them and looking for them. And that's also the work of the writers, right? And creative writers, but also just people like me, your critics. It's our job to find those people and to write about them and to make sure that at least some information about them does get out there so that they can have a broader sort of stage.
Nice. All right, so, oh, come on, greedy Krina. Come on.
I love that.
By the way, you have a beautiful voice.
I mean, come on. I don't know if you guys heard, but the hot stocking stuffers this year. These guys' books, the hot other stocking stuffers, all these glass things on the wall. If Alice hasn't found you with her clipboard for our email listserv, she will before you leave.
Oh, yeah.
And last but not least, I know you've all just been thinking about how good I look all night. You too can look this good because we have Bonk t-shirts in the back. I want to thank Hot Shot Glass so much for having us tonight. I want to thank all of you.